And welcome, everyone. And a warm welcome also to all of you who will watch this recording at a later stage. The 101 series is very much meant to be revisited and to serve as an introduction to corruption measurement. For example, when there are new colleagues joining your teams, so feel free to send along the link to the recording on our webpage once it is up. Today, I'm excited to have Liz David Barrett join us and talk about the future of corruption and anti-corruption measurement. Talking about things such as the gaps that we might have in our measurement efforts, but also the focus of where we might need to locate our efforts. And afterwards, again, that discussion, which I would encourage you to put in your pointers into the chat. If you have thoughts throughout the presentation, just use that chat to get the conversation going throughout. Before I get started and introduce Liz properly, I want to make three quick introductory points before we get into that. One is, you've seen that this series is conceived in 3 installments, and there's a particular reason for that. Just like you would have with any policy proposal, program, portfolio of programs that you might run, it's always useful to start with the why and to really figure out what is the context, what do we want to achieve. And in many ways, this was what Paul was talking about in his first presentation. And then we moved on last time to Stephanie Trebnell, and she explored the approach and the effects and the trade-offs that different types of measurement have. So that's, again, usually irrespective of the medium of where we do our thinking or do our actions, that's a useful sequence. And then we want to close it out today with Liz on what this means and where we go with these insights that we have gathered over many years and the approaches and effects that we have seen and tested over time. So we very much hope over at our unit in SIPE at the Anti-Corruption and Governance Unit that this type of progression makes sense to you, and that when you talk to colleagues about measurement, perhaps that you might also reference back to these sessions and say, look, here's 1, 2, 3. It might just be helpful to go through that quickly. So before I go into my second and third point of what I want to mention, I want to pitch it over to Liz actually right away without introducing you properly just yet. And ask perhaps for your reflections on what we took away from Paul's presentation, or what you took away from Paul's presentation and from Steph's presentation, and that then leads into your presentation in a few minutes. Over to you, Liz.
Yeah, thanks, Johannes, and thanks very much to you and to SIPE for organising these sessions. I've actually found them really enjoyable. So I hope others have too. And I think it's been great to work with Paul and Steph and with you on developing it as a series, and it's prompted me to reflect quite a lot. So it's been a great initiative, and I really hope that it's the start of a conversation rather than this being the last instalment today. From Paul's session, I think the sort of real standout takeaway for me is that you can't skip the conceptualization step. That's not just a boring academic thing. It's really central to getting it right, to understanding what you're trying to measure, and whether what you're doing to measure it really makes sense. Are you measuring the things that are really observable? What kind of data can you use to look at that? Have you come up with a method that really relates to what you're trying to do? So I think that's a really key takeaway from me there. And then Steph, really kept that thread going through around how think about what the purpose of measurement is. And whether your method matches up to that purpose that you're trying to achieve. Plus, I also really appreciated how much she talked about the kind of power, resources, interests, and how that affects what we measure, how we measure it, what data is available even, and whether we can kind of sustain measurement over time. So I think those kinds of things around purpose and power were really the big takeaways for me, that we perhaps don't think about that much when we're using measurement. We tend to sort of assume that this is some kind of objective assessment of something, but we can't take shortcuts on thinking about the conceptualization, and in interpreting it, we've got to be thinking about purpose and power as well.
That's great. Thank you. in that case, we do need a term for you today that starts with a P just as well, so we can redub this series as purpose, power, and whatever else comes today. So yes, thank you, Liz, for that. I appreciate that. So we'll build on that in just a few minutes. The second and the third point that I wanted to just briefly mention in terms of an introduction is to say that at the Center for International and Private Enterprise and at our Anti-Corruption Governance Unit, we obviously do a lot of programming. So this whole series in many ways is helpful for us ourselves to just learn and get sharper at the many things that we hope to achieve and want to do on a daily basis. At the same time, we are unable, as I think any of us are unable, to achieve these things if we don't think of ourselves as living in an ecosystem, some anti-corruption ecosystem in which all of us bring together different pieces. So the second purpose of this measurement series to talk about this was from the get-go to just offer that to make it an offer for everybody in our space, and not just on the case of measurement, because as you know or might not know, CIPE works on all kind of things from women empowerment to trade facilitation, to figuring out more generally speaking, how can the private sector help democracies flourish, and how can democracies in turn help the private sector to produce equitable growth. So on all these issue areas, we don't live in an ecosystem in which we can do it on our own and alone. So this series is very much meant also as outreach to say, if you have thoughts, if you want to think and do together something, then please feel free to come back to us, and maybe we can conceive of a second or third installment of a series, whether that's anti-corruption and artificial intelligence, or it's anti-corruption and social norms, for example. So I think there's lots of space where we would just jointly benefit from putting together thinking and then basing our doing on that thinking in order to progress and create impact in the world. So that's the second point. And the third point that I want to mention is just to thank again all my colleagues at the Anti-Corruption and Governance Unit who are in the background, who helped to make this series and many others come to life. As I'm sure all of you know, there is so much navigation, administration, getting dates right and technology right, and all these different pieces that are really important to make something like this work. So just a quick shout out to Johanna, who is on screen, but also to Holly, Dylan, Hazel, of course, Frank, Matt Mossman, and some others who have all contributed in different ways to making this work. So last but not least, I can introduce Liz properly and then hand it over to you to run through your presentation. As most of you know Liz already, she is she's a professor and director at the Center for Study of Corruption at Sussex University, and also serves as deputy director for research under the GIA's program, the global, now I need to get this right. It's not the global integrity. Which one is it? The Governance and Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. But more than anything else, Liz occupies this unique space in our ecosystem in which she has worked for think tanks, for academia, has worked with governments, with civil society, and really both advises and also listens to what people come back with, what the issues are. She's been in a lot of conversations on private sector questions, on how to do measurement right, how to do anti-corruption right. And that in some ways is a unique way of positioning yourself as an academic in this space to really facilitate this two-way communication time and time again with so many different actors in countries around the world. So thank you, Liz, for coming on today and for presenting your piece on the future of measurement today. I think that's all I needed to say and wanted to say. So I'll hand it over to you. The floor is yours, Liz.
That's great. Thanks very much, Johannes. I am going to share some slides, which hopefully you can see. Yes, I have this task of talking about where we're going and what's in store in the future in terms of corruption measurement. But I'm going to be doing a few things overall. So we've talked a bit about recap, but I have a little bit more to say on that. Then we'll go into what are the drivers really of corruption measurement today? And this is partly based on some work that I did when I was at the International Anti-Corruption Academy and running the global program on measurement there, where we were particularly interested in understanding this kind of market for corruption measurement. What's the demand? Who actually needs these measures and what do they need them for? Then we're going to focus in particularly on national level initiatives. So not the global indices, but what's happening at the national level. Talk a little bit about some of the practicalities, nuts and bolts of measurement. And then look at what are the remaining blind spots? What do we not know? What do we need to measure better before finishing up with some conclusions? So my first slide then is actually drawing very much on what we learned from Paul and Steph's presentations about power and purpose. And it's doing so with a graphic that was produced by Transparency International as part of their advocacy efforts. And I really like the graphic because I think it tells us a lot about these aspects of how power and purpose are so central to corruption measurement. So what you've got on the screen here, two top tens from two different global aggregate indices. On the left, you've got the Financial Secrecy Index, which measures how much a country is kind of facilitating potentially money laundering and also tax evasion through the financial secrecy framework that it has in place. And you've got there the top 10 worst countries for financial secrecy. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the TI Corruption Perceptions Index that we all know so well, which measures perceptions of public sector corruption. And there you've got the top 10 best performers, though, so the cleanest. So they're different ways round of looking at the issue. But what's very interesting to me is that those countries that are highlighted in yellow are on both. So they're the worst for financial secrecy and among the best for the public sector corruption as measured by the CPI. So this to me is very interesting in telling us that it's really important to think about what it is we're interested in measuring. So these are obviously different aspects of the corruption problem, but the fact that a country can be the worst on one measure and the best on another really, for me, evokes how important it is to think very carefully about what we're measuring. And also, if we're users of measurement, to think very carefully about what the makers of the index have measured and how we can then use that and what we can take away from it. It also, of course, speaking to that power aspect of things, the fact that we had the TI CPI was the main index that we looked at for many years, and that told a particular story in which it was often the richer countries in the global north that looked very clean and nothing to worry about on that index. And the Financial Secrecy Index, which is more of a newcomer to the global indices space, but has very much made us focus on the fact that those better off countries in the global north are very much part of the problem. So in a way, these two indices also show how the policy debate has moved on in the last couple of decades. So moving on then to think about what the drivers of the demand for corruption measurement are. So we heard from Paul about those early indices around the TICPI and the World Bank Worldwide Governance Indicators. And very much there, they were about advocacy and getting people to sit up and take notice about corruption. But we're 30 years on from the first CPI. So we were interested in finding out what the current drivers of demand for corruption measurement are. And as I say, this builds partly on my work at IACA, but also on work that we've done at the Centre for the Study of Corruption. So the first thing that we find is driving corruption measurement today is those international conventions and international goals that are being set. And what that means is that creates a need for governments in particular to be able to demonstrate that they're complying with their commitments and that they're making progress towards those goals. So clearly, in terms of conventions, we've got the UN Convention Against Corruption, we've got the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, then we've got things like the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly with Goal 16 around corruption. And we've got other standards, for example, the Financial Action Task Force standards, focusing very much on anti-money laundering and showing that countries have got in place measures and practices that are seen to be a useful part of the AML framework. So countries make commitments to these, then they need to, in the case of conventions, put those into national law. And UNCAC and the OECD have their own mechanisms for monitoring progress and implementation. But what you find within that is that countries often need ways of evidencing the facts that they're implementing. And so that creates demand for being able to measure different aspects of corruption, but also of anti-corruption control. And again, one of the things that Steph talked about last week, sometimes we're talking about measuring the prevalence of corruption itself. Sometimes we're talking about measuring the risks of that corruption, but quite often now we're also talking about measuring how good anti-corruption policy and practice is. So a lot of this really fits into that bucket. A second big driver that we found of demand for corruption measurement is around business norms and reputation. So the private sector partly wants also to signal its compliance with national laws. So the UK Bribery Act or Sapin 2 in France. And that's, again, often that's about how the laws are written and the fact that you can often, as a corporation, be treated more leniently if you can be shown to have good practices in place that should protect the organisation against bribery and prevent it from getting involved in bribery. So again, that creates this demand to be able to signal how well you're complying. But also we see that corporations want to be able to demonstrate progress against environmental, social and governance indicators, ESG. Lots of investors have made commitments that they will look at ESG when thinking about where to invest assets. And so that, again, has created this demand on the corporate side to be able to show that they're living up to these ESG commitments. And then similarly, getting more specific, the ISO 37100 around anti-bribery. Again, companies want to be able to signal compliance with that. And so what we see here, this is partly driven by legal frameworks, but also partly driven by a need to get reputational benefits from demonstrating your adherence to these standards. And companies hope that by being able to demonstrate that, they'll get various benefits around how they're treated by regulators, how they're treated by investors, and also by consumers, where consumers care about these kinds of things. And then the third bucket of drivers for corruption measurement really is coming from national level anti-corruption practitioners. One of the big things that we've seen in the last 30 years is the anti-corruption space, policy and practice has really developed massively and mushroomed, and there are an awful lot of people whose job is anti-corruption now. And they particularly want to be able to measure what they're doing for various different reasons. So sometimes this is around government agencies wanting to track their anti-corruption progress. Often they have introduced a national anti-corruption strategy or plan, and they want to be able to show that they're making progress against it. Partly that's useful for them internally, so they can work out where to devote most of their anti-corruption resources or in the case of audit agencies, where to prioritize scarce audit resources. It might be about identifying whether they should stop a certain policy or intervention. Maybe it's not working. And so, again, given scarce resources, they should stop doing that and do something else instead. Or it might be about making a case internally to get more financial or human resources. So we often find that anti-corruption agencies need to be able to go to the finance ministry and say, look how well we're doing, we're saving you lots of money. So you please give us more resources so that we can do more of this good stuff. So often it's driven by these internally facing demands to be able to evidence what's going on, as well as also the externally facing demand to be able to show progress against a strategy or a plan. Now, I'm going to focus now in the next bit of the presentation largely on what's happening at this national level, and partly because there's so much interesting work going on there, and I think it's quite useful for some countries to be able to learn from others in terms of what's happening and what's seen as good practice there. So delving in then to the national level practice, and then this sort of also builds up upon some of the things that were covered in sessions 1 and 2 by Paul and Steph around the different methods that are used for measuring corruption. So one thing that we talked about a little bit is enforcement data. This tends to be something which builds on what laws there are in a country around corruption and measures in terms of where there have been convictions for those offences or at an earlier stage investigations or complaints, for example. And what's good practice here is to be able to have time series data so that you can see how this evolves over time. So the top diagram that we've got here is from France, from the Anti-Corruption Agency in France, and they will produce in their annual reports data around convictions by offence. So you can then monitor that from year to year and see how that is changing. It's useful to have it disaggregated not just by offence, but ideally also by region or sector. Sometimes you get the financial costs as well. So Germany is actually very good in having quite disaggregated data on that. And again, that allows you to monitor some trends and understand what's happening. There are, of course, limitations in this in terms of using it to measure the prevalence of corruption. As we've talked about in previous sessions, it depends on things like the autonomy and resources of the enforcement agencies. And then what we've got here at the bottom as well is data from Guatemala. So what's also good practice is to be able to monitor the progress of cases as they go through. So here you see that in the case of Guatemala, you can monitor through from the complaint, the investigation, and see how it's tracking through the actual enforcement process. Surveys are still very commonly used at the national level, and a really good example of this is Lithuania, which has been measuring corruption annually since 2001. What's also seen as good practice is measuring not just by surveying the public, but also taking samples from business and from civil servants. And so Lithuania is an example of a country that does all three of those. And it's good because it allows you to then triangulate among those different samples. Are you getting similar kinds of pictures from those different perspectives? It also enables you, if you're doing it annually, to track how things are changing over time. You can see that it looks like things are getting much better in Lithuania in terms of having to give bribes. And also, what is often useful in this, in conducting surveys, is to combine them with surveys that are already happening. So the big downside of surveys is that they're expensive. And so it makes sense if you're already doing something like a crime victimization survey or some other national household survey to put in a module about corruption that enables you to get access to large samples, but also to reduce your costs. So bringing in some of those practical considerations to thinking about how best to do this. What some countries also do is add questions about perceptions of anti-corruption practice and policy. So in Indonesia, for example, the KPK collects a lot of data about how its work is perceived, again, from different groups, from the public, from internals, and also from the partners of the KPK itself. So you can also add that element in if that's something that's important. Then moving on to another kind of method. So TI developed a methodology for doing national integrity assessments many years ago. And how that worked was that they looked at different institutions that should provide a kind of immunity to corruption or a way of controlling it. And then they used experts to assess countries according to the quality of those institutions and their ability to protect against corruption. So that's not often done at the country level anymore, although the methodology has been adapted recently by AJ Brown and it's been updated and used in Australia. But what has happened is that that kind of overall approach of assessing integrity has been adapted to the organizational level. And so that's used, for example, in France and in Italy by the anti-corruption agencies. They have actually imposed an obligation on public sector organizations, and in the case of France, also in large companies, where they require them to undertake these assessments and to self-report on essentially their integrity system or their compliance controls. So that's also something that we're seeing happening a lot more. I would say it's quite a big burden on organizations sometimes to do that. So it's probably not something that less well-resourced countries might want to do, but it's then collecting a huge amount of data which anti-corruption agencies can use to try and control and to track the risks and to encourage improvements all the time in compliance and integrity. Proxy indicators, again, we've talked about in earlier sessions. The most popular of these is around public procurement risk indicators, and lots of countries have built interactive data analytics portals now. Something that, as has been mentioned, I've worked on with Mihai Fazekas, and which we worked on through our GIACE funded research, but has really, really proliferated. And Open Contracting Partnership has done some great work in promoting this and helping countries to develop some really sophisticated portals now. In addition to that, sometimes we've seen contextual risk indicators. So Italy is quite interesting in having developed these contextual risk indicators, which you see at the bottom of the picture here. So they look into different aspects in society, so the level of criminality, for example, take data on things like cheating in education, in schools, and they're using that based on the academic research which shows that these things are related to levels of corruption, using that to develop these contextual risk indicators at the regional level, which then they can use and in fact the public sector organizations can use as part of their integrity assessments that they're doing. So again, trying to sort of think about how much they might be exposed to risk as a result of these underlying factors. Other proxies that we see: public expenditure tracking, looking for leakages in public funds. Does it get to the places that it's supposed to get to? Lifestyle audits. This is something that's being trialed in South Africa, where they're matching up data from the conflict of interest and declarations asset declarations of public officials, matching that up with data from the land registry, the vehicle registry. So trying to detect whether there might be illicit wealth that's being accumulated there. So I think some really interesting, innovative work going on there. So we had quite a lot of questions last week about AI and how AI is being used and can be used. I think at the moment this is mainly being used for detection and kind of triage or filtering. So Brazil is a great example. It's really a very early adopter, particularly through the CGU in Brazil, the Controller General's unit, but also some other organizations in Brazil, the Ombudsman and other regulators also using a lot of AI. So often they're using it for identifying risks in public procurement data again. But also they're analysing suspicious transaction reports and conflict of interest disclosures. And to just sort of delve into one of them that I particularly like, they've got one which screens whistleblower complaints. So essentially they're getting a lot of complaints from members of the public, and they've got scarce resources to go and investigate those. So they're first using AI to extract known entities and individuals and contracts, to match that up and join them up to look for the networks. And then on the basis of that, they're assigning a risk score. They then essentially triage the cases according to whether they're low, medium, or high risk, and then decide where to devote their resources according to those risk scores, and also whether they need to be, whether they definitely need investigation or whether you need a human to go in and look in more detail at what's going on before making a decision about whether to investigate further. So I think that's a really interesting adaptation and use of AI, and they do think that it has improved their response rates to whistleblower complaints. And then monitoring and evaluation. And then this is something that, again, we started to talk about quite a lot in session 2. So thinking about how much you can use measurement to monitor and track change. So this is a key reason that we found for anti-corruption agencies or units within government wanting to do more national level measurement. So we found that it's a big source of demand. At the same time, we also found that practices are generally pretty weak and poor, and this is particularly coming out of some research that we did at the CSC. So a 2017 review that had been done by Mark Pyman of 41 strategies found that actually less than a third of those strategies provided any kind of clear timelines or deadlines for the reforms that were in them. Less than half included any quantitative criteria or indicators. And then where they did have quantitative indicators, they were not necessarily appropriate for tracking change at the level at which interventions operated. So many of them had their country's CPI score in there as an indicator, but in fact, the things that they were doing were not likely to influence that score. If you look over on the left, I've actually taken from the OECD's public integrity indicators their measure of the quality of integrity and anti-corruption strategies at the country level. So what you can see is they measure them on different aspects, but evaluation practice is the one up there in the kind of 11 o'clock slot. So what you can see there is the dark blue line in the middle is the sort of average of where practice is at the moment. So you can see that it's really falling short in terms of evaluation practice. The pale blue shaded area is the best practice according to the OECD. So, that is, doing much better on evaluation. But again, this suggests that most countries, and that's even looking at OECD countries, which are wealthier, more advanced in terms of their anti-corruption mechanism often, they're really behind when it comes to evaluation practice. And so the second graphic that I've got on the screen here is a recent publication from my colleague Tom Shipley, which has been published by U4. And he's looking at the state of practice when it comes to evaluating anti-corruption interventions. So again, I would really recommend that for anyone who is interested in this topic. But one of Tom's findings is that evaluations are rarely based on a theory of change. This goes back again a little bit to Paul's point in the first session around the importance of conceptualization. And if you're looking at monitoring change, you've really got to have a theory about how you think you're going to achieve that change as a starting point for any kind of evaluation. And so the fact that this is so rarely included is a real warning sign. Many of them also lack baseline studies. Again, something that Steph talked about last week in session 2. If you want to measure change, you've really got to know where you started off. So again, thinking about that as part of monitoring and evaluation. So moving on then to just some of the nuts and bolts and practical things to think about in corruption measurement. So I've got a few design considerations here. Again, partly this builds on and reiterates things we've already heard. But the really most important one is which method is most appropriate for what you want to measure. So think very carefully about what you are trying to measure. If it's in a whole anti-corruption strategy, that might mean there are many different things that you're trying to measure, and you might need different methods for measuring all of them. So you think about what can you use for this? What is it appropriate to measure through a survey? What is it that you're not going to be able to measure through a survey because not enough people will feel comfortable talking about it, or not enough people will actually have experience of it, or perhaps you don't have the resources to keep doing that. So that's not appropriate. If you've got administrative data, then think about how you can develop proxy indicators based on administrative data that might measure that particular aspect. So, thinking very carefully about what's most appropriate for what you are trying to do. And the second thing I'd say is there something that's already available that you can adapt to your purpose? We did some work in the global program at IACA around measuring the effectiveness of anti-corruption agencies. And one of the takeaways from that is that actually there are already 3 or 4 tools that you can use, which you might want to adapt to your own purposes. They might not be a perfect fit, but it's probably a good starting point rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So are there things that you can use and adapt? Thirdly, thinking about how you're going to do your data collection. And something, again, talked about a lot in session 2. Do you want that data collection to be participatory? Can you involve people in it? What are the implications of doing that? Will that data then be open and published? Again, what are the implications of that? And if you do want it to be open and published, have you got the right structures in place to enable that to actually happen, which might be partly legal framework, might also be IT infrastructure. And then something that I think is often really overlooked: how do you set up the administrative systems that are actually going to use your data? So you really want this measurement to be influential and effective. And part of that is about designing it to be actionable, as we've talked about. But part of it is also about having people who are tasked with using it and incorporating it into their work. So making sure that there's that feedback loop all the time, not just that you're collecting data, but actually on the basis of that, someone is going to interpret it, work out where you might need to change policy, and then actually make sure that they change the policy. And this bit is so often missing in terms of how we're using measurement. I think Indonesia is a great case on this, actually, because a lot of the measurement that the KPK is doing is really then built into their systems. So they're using it to go back and talk to different regions and municipal level governments about how they improve their practices. In some cases, they're also incentivizing them according to the scores that they get on this. They can get more resources and assistance for help with improving the structures there. But it's a good case where the data doesn't just go out there into the ether, it actually gets incorporated. And it's someone whose job it is to look at using that data and making sure that it is acted upon. I've put on the right here the Vienna Principles on measuring corruption. This is something that we came up with as part of the global program on measuring corruption in collaboration with our partners at a global conference in August of 2023. So with UNODC, UNDP and the OECD. I think they're useful. They're meant as guidance for people who were involved in constructing measures, but also for people who are using corruption measures in their work. And then just to talk a bit too about some of the constraints that it's worth thinking about. So a key one is around resources. And again, what we found from talking to a number of the sort of producers of corruption measures is that this is quite a big constraint. Measurement is often expensive. Some methods are more expensive than others. But it's really important to make sure that you've got the resources there to do that and that they're going to be there in a sustainable way and on an ongoing basis. So think about whether this is something that is resourced sufficiently to be able to do it well. Second constraint is often interoperability of systems. A lot of the really interesting work in measurement is about matching up data sets between different agencies and organizations and systems. But that requires that there is some interoperability between those organizations. And actually, that's something that is often lacking. So not many government systems are set up so that agencies can easily share data. Sometimes they need to put in place legal frameworks to allow them to share data among agencies. We found some instances of state agencies charging each other for data. So in South Africa, I think the land registry was charging another bit of the civil service for data, and that meant that they couldn't afford to update their integrity systems and lifestyle audits very often because of the resource constraints of having to buy the data. So thinking about some of those issues around the sharing and the practicalities of it too. And related to this very much is privacy and constraints on sharing of data that are coming from privacy laws, which can also inhibit even the sharing of data among government agencies. So this is usually something that can be worked around or overcome, but it does take some thought around whether privacy laws are potentially going to constrain sharing among agencies and whether you then need to put in place memoranda of understanding or legal frameworks that facilitate that. And then finally, just thinking about consistency. And I think it's partly a methodological problem. So in anti-corruption practice, we know that the practices of how corrupt actors work change a lot. And that creates a problem if you want to have consistent measures over time. So there's a trade-off between whether you always measure the same thing or whether you adapt your measure. Could be to try and adapt to new corrupt practices, or it could be to adapt to the fact that new data has come on stream and you can now measure things differently. So just thinking about, again, those trade-offs between trying to get consistent measurement that allows you to do time series versus adapting to the changing environment and the changing capacity around what can be measured. Okay, blind spots. What are we still not very good at measuring? So first of all, I've put business integrity, partly because that's of interest, I think, to some of SIPE's audience, given the work on the private sector. So, I mean, one big development here is ESG indicators. So in theory, this gives us a lot more data around controls on corruption, particularly with the governance aspect of that. But I want to sound a word of caution on this. One is that I think that the G aspect is often much less developed than the E and S. The other is that the academic research on ESG indicators suggests that there is a real proliferation of creators of these indicators, and there is very little correlation among them. And that suggests that, or it creates an opportunity for a gaming and a kind of fairly strategic use of ESG indicators to prove the point that you want to make, or to pick and choose the one that makes you look good. So I think there's need for some caution around these, need to look quite carefully at what they're measuring. There's also some indications that the way that they're rated by experts is not very standardized, that sometimes there are rater biases, and also the kinds of biases where if they've rated a company well on one aspect, they tend to rate them well on others, perhaps just because they expect there to be a pattern. So we're still digging into what's going on there and what's going wrong. But I think at the moment, this is something where I would sound a note of caution about how robust those are. Second aspect here in business integrity is often looking at compliance with laws. Again, I talked a little bit about how that's often driven by the laws themselves and the way that they're enforced. So creating incentives to be able to show that you've got good compliance and good governance procedures in place so that if something does go wrong, you can argue for leniency. So these things are useful, but they are very much driven by the laws themselves and the guidance around them. So what adequate procedures looks like in the UK Bribery Act. They can be a bit formulaic and shallow. I do think there's improvement here, and that's partly because enforcement authorities are looking much more at effectiveness of compliance programs. So the DOJ has been looking much more at what an effective program looks like rather than just box ticking kind of a program. So there's some improvement there. There's also potential, I think, for AI to help here. So an obvious potential use for AI is to take data from organizations and companies around their internal communications and to look in that for evidence that they're actually practicing what they preach in terms of the compliance procedures. So potentially AI could be used as a kind of validity check on whether practice is following the compliance talk. So assessing in a way the depth of internal compliance programs. A second area where I think we still have a big gap in measurement is around illicit financial flows. That's a pity because it's an increasingly big focus of anti-corruption policy, of course, with the focus on grand corruption and on anti-money laundering measures. One of the issues here, I think, is that illicit financial flows themselves are quite poorly defined. So it gets back to the conceptualization problem. But where they are defined, it's often around being illicit in origin, transfer, or use. And if we take those three aspects, then it's really the transfer part that is likely to be the most observable. Potentially, transfers of funds are observable from banking data, but that's often obscured by a lack of transparency about the company ownership. And we know, of course, that it's very easy for people to obscure the ownership of companies and then to have these multiple layered complex transactions. So beneficial ownership transparency should help with this. But there's also a lot of data that is collected but is privately held. So part of the advocacy ask here, I think, is around lobbying more to get access to data that is collected but not open. So we could do a lot more there. There's some great research that uses leaked data to monitor patterns, e.g. there's the GI8 research by my colleague at Sussex, Dan Haberley. He's going to be having more results on that coming out soon. And he's created this great database around the regulatory interventions in this space, which can then be used to match against patterns of illicit conduct. So some good things there that are coming out of the academic research. There's also potential, I think, for innovation in terms of that aspect of measuring corruption control here. So we could do more potentially to measure how well countries are protecting themselves against illicit financial flows through looking at, for example, the quality of their data around politically exposed persons, the quality of their beneficial ownership transparency registers. So I can see that there might be more measures developed there that would allow us to sort of take that measuring anti-corruption approach, but could be quite useful in the future. And then thirdly, state capture is still an area where there is a lack of measurement, improving considerably, I think, in terms of multi-country national level measures through a couple of initiatives. So one is that Daniel Kaufman has recently come out with a new state capture index. So that's got 3 different aspects around capture of the rule of law, capture of politics and policy, and also the enabling ecosystem for capture, using indicators as subcomponents of that are already collected by third parties, but bringing them into a new index. And one of the interesting things about that is that it does reveal quite different patterns to your kind of more traditional TI measure that looks at the more lower level public sector corruption. So that's a great contribution where the data set is available. And also the Center for the Study of Democracy in Bulgaria has developed a state capture assessment diagnostic, which they've trialed in a number of countries in the Balkans. And again, through some current GIS research, they're matching that up with illicit financial flows data and thinking about how that also works against the UNODC measures too around illicit financial flows. So there's work being done there that we hope will yield more work and more clarity around measuring state capture at the national level. We also, though, I think need a lot more work on indicators that would look at individual mechanisms of capture. So we've got the public procurement risk indicators, which are often used here and which can be developed particularly with network analysis to try to identify capture networks in public procurement. Another growth area, again, being developed is around indicators of capture in legislative process. Again, Mihai Fazekas is working on this with colleagues at the CEU and further afield in Global Corruption Observatory. But so this is looking at how the legislative process can be manipulated in ways that reduce the amount of scrutiny on legislation, rush it through, mean that, for example, laws are made in big omnibus laws where, in fact, most of the real detail of the legislation happens at a later stage without much, without any parliamentary scrutiny. So developing indicators there around how the legislative process is being captured. So I think the sort of what we need more of is around that mechanism level indicators of capture. So finally, then, just a few sort of concluding reflections here. We really see that there's a lot more demand for subnational and sectoral indicators, and I think that reflects awareness that corruption itself is very varied, and it needs very targeted responses. And so the very first step of that is getting the more detailed evidence about how it's happening, and that can then lead on to understanding points for potential interventions. Governments and anti-corruption agencies really want indicators that will enable them to monitor and evaluate progress. That's often related to national anti-corruption strategies, but it's an area where practice at the moment is still quite weak and quite behind, and there's a need for much more learning around that. Thirdly, there is major innovation happening in public sector data analytics. So I talked about the many different examples of this in Brazil, but it's happening in many countries around the world too. It's something that has been enabled partly by the open data movement and open government movement, meaning that we get a lot more data, partly also by better computing power and analytic capacity in terms of machine learning. So it's a big growth area, but several sort of caveats around that, in that it does require sustained investment, partly in IT infrastructure, in the data collection process and standardization. It requires ability to share data among organizations, and it requires people with the skills to really do the analysis properly. So it's a huge source of potential, but it's also not easy to do, and it requires a lot of investment. And finally, just to say that there are big remaining gaps in our ability to measure certain aspects of corruption and inform policy. And that's worrying, because all the things we've learned over the course of this series around importance of conceptualization and importance of power and interests in what we can measure, all of that should make us quite worried about things where we're not yet collecting data very well, because there's a big danger that we're then missing out on important parts of the picture, that we're not developing the policy that we need to address them, that we're not understanding whether the policies we do have are working, and potential that we're missing out on a lot of really important things there. So I guess that leads me to a sort of general call for more innovation in this area. And also thinking all the time about what new data sources are coming on stream that could be used a lot more, but perhaps not being used yet.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Liz. This is great. And on that last note, I think when you led the global program on measuring corruption, that's precisely what you did, right? You tried to identify those spots, be it at national level or sectorial, thematic. Where do we need to do what type of measurement? And you've explained some of those and laid those out at least. That's great. One thing that came to my mind when I just heard you speak now is perhaps to amend our purpose power with presence, because the presence of those of us either being engaged in measurement and or running programming, whether it's policy level or at the implementation level, that presence of mind, that energetic embrace of really trying to move the programming forward by doing useful measurement. Maybe that's our third P there in this series. Anyways, thank you so much, Liz, for a great, very useful presentation, laying out some of the considerations that we can all and should think about going forward. In the meantime, we've had a few people chime in on the chat, and I think I want to start with Mario in this case, Mario Blanco. Do you want to quickly come in and explain what you're thinking about?
Sorry, I was not prepared to speak, but in Colombia we have several problems when we are conducting corruption assessments. We have tried different methodologies, but specifically I want to talk about corruption fight measurements in the subnational sectors, in the subnational entities. There we have some problems because the regulations to fight corruption are constantly changing. So it's really difficult because in public policy the entities always want to compare the results, but it's impossible for us to make a comparison when the comparison factors are different, right? So
Yeah.
that's our main problem, but um, also we are trying to standardize some things like the international conventions are kind of useful because the convention don't often don't have changes. So the conventions are useful for us to try to stabilize or
Mm.
to keep the variables of the assessments. That's my explanation, but sorry if I don't bring more details here.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are just very difficult trade-offs, essentially. It is very difficult to compare across different systems with different regulations. So, often, for example, when we talk about the public procurement risk indicators, there is some comparing across countries, but you often need to think quite carefully about what's the regulation in this country to be able to standardize them in ways that make sense. Even just very simple things around what's the threshold of transparency, you need to be able to think about ways of standardizing a value threshold in a way that makes sense within the economy of that particular country. So a $10,000 value threshold in one country will mean something different to a $10,000 value threshold in another country. So there's a particular problem with comparing across jurisdictions, and I think you were talking about different subnational units, but also when it comes to the country level. So you might have to just say there, look, there are things that we can't compare across jurisdictions. Maybe you can come up with a subset of indicators which are standard across those, and you can compare among that sort of smaller data set and then enrich it in individual examples from the different subnational units. Or, as you say, the strategy is to go back to something which is not so variable and not changing around international conventions, although actually the way that they're implemented in different countries often does vary, and often conventions leave quite a lot of scope and ambiguity there to allow countries to implement them in ways that make sense. I mean, one thing that I think is very difficult is we talk a lot about ecosystems in anti-corruption, and the implication of that is that how well you prevent or detect or fight corruption depends on how all these things work together. And that means that if you're just measuring one aspect of that, you're probably not really going to very well measure a lot of relevant things. So, an audit agency might be really critical in one setting, but not so critical in another, depending on what other institutions are there. So that is just one of the really difficult things about trying to compare across jurisdictions, and it makes me quite skeptical about how useful that really is. So maybe we're just better to think about within a particular jurisdiction or unit over time.
Thank you. And I think if I understand correctly, Mario, the other implication of this is that the conceptualization within a given unit and within a given set of interests is so important. So that communication, essentially, that Liz was just mentioning across the ecosystem, becomes ever harder the wider you go, the more you compare across jurisdictions or bodies or sectors of interest. So even within one agency or within one company, it is so hard to really get a consensus on what do we want to measure and how, and then maintain that, I think, as both Liz and Steph said last time. So thank you for that.
Yes,
The
yes. Sorry, I want to say something else. Um, that's right, at, but also across the time, the legislation is one in 1 year. For example, the last year, the regulation to fight corruption in public entities in the subnational level has changed.
Yeah,
Just in 1 year, so it affects all the assessment.
great. Let's.
I think I'm having problem with my internet.
That's all right. Happens to all of us still, despite the pandemic. So next thing I want to lead us over to is a revisit of the AI question. I think, Stacy, you had some thoughts about risks using AI for certain types of measurement.
Yes, thanks, Johannes. And thank you, Liz, for this great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I just had a general question when you were mentioning the use of AI screening, like whistleblower complaints and things like that. I was just wondering, is there any risk present in terms of using that method?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great point. So of course there is a risk with AI. It's looking at, in this case, it's learning from what we have collected in the past, in terms of large language models learning from certain bodies of text in the past. So there is a danger that it will replicate. Partly that it could replicate biases, so what voices are missing from the training data set, as it were, that we might not get. But also then that it replicates biases in terms of how we've detected corruption in the past, in that if we thought that there was a certain model of how the corruption works, it's going to be trained on that and it's going to look for that, and that's not going to potentially make it very adaptable and flexible when we know that actually the corrupt behavior changes a lot. So I do think with all of these things there are risks actually in that too. I think we need to understand a lot more about how these things are working and probably have quite a lot of human checks to try and account for that and try to prevent those risks from becoming baked in.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then to double down on that particular point, I think as stood out from the three presentations by Paul, Stefan, and Liz, this conceptualization aspect, that's essentially the same when we talk about AI, right? Anytime we talk about technology and the use of technology for useful anti-corruption work, it always boils down to the people running the technology having a sensible theory of how that technology should help in order for any programmers to then do something, figure out the accessibility and privacy aspects, including what Steph wrote in the chat about the questions of accessibility of measurement data, to then see whether that works out in practice. But in reality, anytime we look, there is hardly any interest by those funding programming to really see it through over the course of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, to really say we'll start with a piece and then we'll just carry it through. So that just speaks to your last point, Liz, that you did in your presentation on this need for us to both advocate, but then also for funders, whether it's government or private sector funding or anyone else, to really make sure that these things are funded over time and are evaluated in the end, whether they help. I want to acknowledge that I see 3 hands up. So that's Nejib, Heidi, and Frank. We had Frank come in with a question on sextortion earlier, I believe. And then we have also Claire on compliance. So Nejib and Heidi, I don't know what you want to talk about. If your topic fits right now, and if you can explain that, please do come in. First Nejib, then Heidi, and then we'll have Liz respond, please.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I wanted to tell you that I learned a lot because there is a shift from my side. There is a shift from the perception of corruption to a measurement of corruption, and this is great news. I mean, as a specialist in anti-corruption, but I still have question about the social and the ethical aspects of the measurements, because the social perception of corruption differ from one society to another. Some societies accept, for example, small corruption. Others no. how to make or how to take in consideration social and ethical aspects in the measurement to make it more competitive. Thank you.
And Heidi, do you want to follow suit?
Sure. So I'm from Mexico City. My question is about the role of academia and independent evaluations that aren't necessarily managing or involved in anti-corruption measures. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the low rates of the M&E that you highlighted in the presentation. And I'm wondering if it seems like a lot of this, when you're thinking about conceptualization, is really about the policy process and what is acceptable or not acceptable within a state or in the country. And so I'm curious if there are times in which some levels of corruption are okay, and is it okay that we're not and then also when you're using AI, it's usually an evaluation tool. It's not necessarily making sure that all rules and norms are all the same. So is there also a place where we can think about using AI for evaluation and not necessarily for homologizing rules and laws? Thank you.
Shall I answer? Yep. Okay. So Najib, around different conceptualizations in different societies. Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely true. And one of the problems with trying to compare countries, and particularly through any sort of survey-based method, is you don't really know if people have got the same thing in mind when they answer your question. So they might be thinking of something entirely different when they think about corruption, let alone, evaluating it differently in terms of whether they tolerate it or not, and whether they think it's acceptable and reasonable or not. So all of those things are problems. I mean, one thing you can do is you can try and just make questions much more specific. So, giving people specific scenarios and asking about those, rather than assuming that there's a shared understanding of what bribe is or what gift is, for example. That might help to some extent. Or the other thing is really just to move away from trying to measure and compare across countries and think, these are probably completely different animals in different countries. And let's, if we really want to understand at a deep level what's happening, probably go deeper into one particular country where you can account for all of the different situations and the different sorts of experiences that people might have, and really try to understand what it is about those that is seen as corrupt, is potentially harmful or not. I hope that somewhat answers it, but essentially you can't sort of standardize across all of those different social aspects, I think. And then Heidi, around, so there are quite a few sort of different bits of question here, I think. So one was maybe around the role of independent evaluations. I sort of suspected for a long time, having been involved in some evaluations of anti-corruption programming, that there was a big body of evidence out there that is not being incorporated into practice. So Tom Shipley, who's been doing a lot of research on this, I think he's looked into this and it's found that it's only half true. So it is the case that a lot of evaluations are not being incorporated into practice and the learning is not happening. But it's not the case that there is a load of evidence out there that we could be using better, because also the evaluations are often not designed well enough to actually create a really good evidence base. So we need to just get much better at that, and then it could be potentially a really great source, I think, because lots of organizations are commissioning evaluations, and if they were done really well, and if there was a way of sharing the data and they didn't stay private, then that could potentially be a bigger body of knowledge. In terms of using AI for evaluation, yes, I think that could happen. And in a way, that was what I was suggesting could happen with business compliance programs. And if you can actually look at the organization's internal data and look at what's happening in HR and purchasing and all these different aspects of the company and try to understand and detect from that whether the principles that are there in the compliance program are actually being borne out in terms of how people are interacting in the organization, that would in a way give you a way of evaluating whether they're really doing what they say they do in terms of compliance. And similarly, you might be able to use that for other forms of programming. There are, that's based on having access to a lot of organizational data, and there might be privacy and good ethical concerns for not allowing that access. So I think we have to think about carefully about the trade-offs and potential risks of that as well. But it is potentially something that we could do.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just not thinking straight right now. Let's go to Frank real quick, Frank Vogel, and then afterwards we come back to Claire, David, and a follow-up by Heidi.
Hi, thank you very much. I'll be very brief. Liz, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Of all the areas of anti-corruption, I find the hardest to deal with as an activist is sexual corruption. And the biggest problem there is that because of societal, ethical, cultural reasons, victims of sexual corruption do not want to report in many, many places, let alone answer surveys. And yet we find that aid agencies, including the World Bank, very often will say, well, we can't get into this area because we don't have the data. We can't measure the problem. And that's why I think it's one of the hardest areas. What's your suggestion? How do we deal in trying to find data or measure, we find it incredibly difficult, even in a country context. So it'd be marvelous to hear your view on what we do about this, in particular in the area of sexual corruption. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. It's a great question and a really important area, which I think we're, only just even starting to get to grips with. It's also, as you said, an area where the power dynamics are really difficult and make it very difficult to collect data. So, it's not just that it's corruption, which is a sensitive, difficult to observe issue, but then it's extra sensitive because of the sexual aspect to it too. So very difficult. I think it's very difficult really to do anything other than the actual real anthropological, quite deep research with victims. So we did actually an episode of Kickback podcast with Ortran Merkel and Anna Petherick around some of the work they've done, particularly Ortran's done around interviewing trafficking victims and understanding what's going on with them. Now, that's obviously really slow, difficult work where you've got to build up a lot of trust and you're only getting access to certain groups at best. So it's a difficult thing to do. But what would be good is to use that kind of research where it is done to draw out of it what the kind of risk areas and risk patterns are in a way that might be generalizable to other contexts, I think. And then, if we had a sort of a certain set idea of, what the risk factors are, we could think about then looking at organizations and situations where we would expect those risks to be high and make a case for sort of developing controls in those areas that would try to reduce the risks. So, I mean, it's highly imperfect, but it's just an extremely difficult area to research, and I think it's difficult to do it without that really deep, embedded kind of anthropological research.
Thank you, and I think this is a great seg actually to Claire. Over to you, Claire, in terms of assessing risks.
Hi, Liz. It was a great presentation. I think that you answered a significant part of my question when you responded to Heidi Smith. I was looking at the monitoring slide that you put up, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that there is a lot of data that we could utilize from the private sector to understand better corruption measurements within countries. And we have some new legislation that has come through and will take effect in 2025 that we refer to as UK SOX. Now, I don't think that's gone quite far enough, but certainly there is a requirement to record within the annual reports compliance and control and compliance information. Is this something that we could look to obtain, encourage companies to report on more formally in the way that they do ESG metrics, so that we might be able to get a better sense of where there are some areas of concern across countries?
Yeah, I think that sounds like an interesting data source that's coming on stream. It reminds me a little bit of what the French Anti-Corruption Agency is doing with collecting or requiring organizations, or at least larger private sector organizations, to report on their compliance systems. And then, of course, because it's been collected in that case by the Anti-Corruption Agency, they have the capacity to kind of look across the country and look for patterns and trends in that, and engage with the organizations about doing better. So in a way, this data that you're talking about, what is being provided by companies, what's missing there is some central body that can look across that and look for patterns and try to have some broader learning coming out of it. So that does sound like something that could potentially be useful to do. Of course, there will always be limitations. It's a self-assessment, so there could be biases in the reporting there. We probably don't want to require too much of smaller companies, so it needs to be proportionate. But it does sound like that's something that we could potentially use and analyze to look at broader patterns.
Thank you so much. And over to David and your sectorial approach or question about the sector.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for the presentation. Good to see you again. There are a number of efforts now that I'm familiar with that are looking at sector level anti-corruption specifically and trying to do kind of measure corruption risk assessments. So I participated in a session in Tunisia a little while ago, looked at the water sector in a number of the MENA countries. UNDP, at least in the MENA region, has really been pushing this kind of sector approach. We were even starting it a bit in Lebanon before the recent crisis and hit. So I was just curious how those sector tools, which are all at the national level, to the best of my knowledge, or at least implemented at the national level, how those fit into your framework of national level kind of corruption measures. Because I guess I'm trying to get at the difference between kind of measuring the risk versus measuring corruption, right? These tools seem to look at gaps and holes in the accountability and integrity processes at a sector level, not necessarily measuring how much corruption is in the sector level. So there's a difference there. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I mean, what we found is that there's a lot of demand for these more sectoral level measures, and that's again partly sort of reflecting how different corruption can be. So if you're an investor and you're interested in corruption, then you probably only care about your particular sector or the region where you're thinking of investing, not in some kind of country level score. So there's certainly the demand there. In terms of measuring risk versus corruption prevalence, they're both valid things to do. probably the sort of, the measuring the risk one is something which is less sensitive, less controversial. So in certain contexts, there might be more appetite for that. It's inherently more positive oriented in that it's then going to be used to reduce the risks. So built into it, in a sense, is the actionability. It is very important. I think that there's a good theory underlying that. So is it really a corruption risk? And what's the evidence that that's based on that allows us to say that? And that is a more, that's something that you might derive from theory, or you might derive from actual evidence about where corruption's happening, which is then sort of, your other point around what should we really be measuring. There's clearly different things that you can measure. Ideally, you would measure both, and you would understand whether your sense of where the risks are is backed up by what you see in the prevalence. And then you would, on the basis of the risks, you would take actions and interventions to try and reduce the risks. And you would want to see whether that's backed up in the data on prevalence. So ideally, you would have both of those things. I guess it depends on your circumstance in terms of resources and capacity and how difficult it is to actually investigate whether you've got both of those things. But that would be the ideal. They're definitely different things.
Thank you for that. So two thoughts. One is, this goes back to your slide list, to the last slide in your conclusions, and the top point, demand for sectoral assessments and sector-specific assessments, whether risk or corruption, prevalence of corruption. In some ways, one of the things that stand out to me is that we used to have a bunch more indicators across different organizations, and the funding for that dried up, and just, despite there still being demand. So, and I think, as you also laid out, maybe it is indeed on national actors at country level, whether it's ACAs or anyone else in that space, to really help them promote a particular set of indicators that do either the risk or the corruption measurement, and just try to promote them to do more of that work and allocate the funding. Because otherwise, I at least don't see as much of those indicators as there used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a space where some really good indicators have been discontinued, or they don't get done very often. I mean, World Bank enterprise surveys, I think, are great, but very expensive and difficult to do. But give us some really quite concrete data where they are done. So, the frustrating thing about this is that there's actually a patchwork of data out there at different levels, and you can't bring it all together necessarily to tell one story, because it's all been collected according to different methodologies. But we can at least, we can do a little bit of triangulation if we also do it in a careful way where we understand all those differences and limitations, and so try not to draw the wrong conclusions. But in a sense, all of those different measures that are out there, we can use as kind of layers of understanding, as long as we interpret it carefully.
Thank you. Yes, helpful. And Steph is just commenting in the chat to say, not to mix this up and conflate good governance and lower corruption risk. Thank you. I think this brings us to the end of this particular conversation. Liz, did you want to say something?
No, just to agree really with Steph's point there. And, I think the other one around is also around transparency, and whether transparency necessarily reduces corruption. There's lots of other factors along the way. So we have to be careful about creating indicators that make too simplistic assumptions about the relationship between aspects of governance and corruption control.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think this brings us to the end of our session today. I want to thank the audience, every participant now in this session, but also in the first two sessions, for your contributions, for your thoughts, and for nudging the conversation forward. If there is any interest to follow up on any of these items, I think both or all three of them, Paul, Steph, and Liz, are definitely vested in this field and have interest to follow what you're thinking, and so do we at CIPE. So please feel free to reach out. But thank you also, and perhaps foremost, to Liz, Steph, and Paul for taking the time and really presenting us with your thinking and your collective and collected experience and insights over so many years that you've been following these spaces and contributing to them and shaping them. So thank you to all three of you. I think that's it.